Hello, and welcome to the Learning from Practice podcast from the Center for Peacemaking Practice at George Mason University's School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. If you've listened to any of our previous podcasts, then you know that we've created this service to try to share stories of peacemaking practice and practitioners from around the world. One of the other goals we had in mind when we started this center at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution was to work at bridging the gap between theory and practice, to take this learning from practice and to bring it into theory development, some of which we hope happens when you listen to these stories, but also to take the learning from research and theory and see how that interacts with practice. That's a bit of what we're going to do today. In this podcast, you'll hear pieces of an interview I did with Dr. Lynn Underwood. So thank you for being here, and then I'll just ask you to start off, just introduce yourself and say a little bit about what it is that you do.
Okay. Well, my name's Lynn Underwood, and my training was in epidemiology, which kind of looks at patterns of disease, patterns of social situations, and then seeing cause and effect in patterns.
Lynn is a researcher who looks at and measures data, and she's been working on projects that try to measure some of the messy data that comes about when you look at human beings.
How do you measure messy human beings, and how does that end up working for helping us to study human beings, and measuring the more soft aspects of the human being, things like stress and social support, and then moving in more recently into measuring spiritual issues that might be important for people. And in the context of a large measurement endeavor, trying to look at how would we measure religion and spirituality, I developed a scale of 16 questions.
So Lynn developed a daily spiritual experience scale to measure how often these experiences happened in individuals' daily lives. Now, why are we talking to Lynn on a podcast about peacemaking practice?
It seems to be important in terms of this kind of work you're doing in peacemaking, because it seems to relate to important things in people's lives. A lot of people think this is often a driver. It drives the bus. It often drives their motivations. It shapes their thinking. It also can create obstacles between people. They think, oh, you have a different belief and I have a different belief, and therefore we can't really converse. And this is, I was hoping, one of the things to emerge from it is to provide sort of a bridge for people.
So what is the daily spiritual experience scale?
Maybe describe a little bit about the scale itself. Okay, so I'm going to have to look at my notes because I often forget what the 16 questions are if I don't have notes. I guess one of the things is thinking about why did I pick these questions. We often measure spirituality and religiousness in very specifically religious ways. And the problem then is what happens when somebody's not religious? What happens when they're secular? What happens when they have one religion, somebody has another? If you get too particular in terms of beliefs, then it tends to measure some things that are valuable, but not what I wanted to measure something that might be common between religious traditions, and also some things that might apply to people who weren't particularly religious and were maybe even uncomfortable with religion. So what is the scale? It's 16 kind of multiple choice questions, and you answer frequency from many times a day to a 5, 6 sliding scale down to never, almost never. Many times a day, occasionally never, almost never.
Okay.
It's been used in over 150 published studies, and linking it to many good outcomes like happiness, social good relationships, less burnout, so a variety of good things. Some mental health outcomes.
So in that case, it would be a correlation in the sense of scoring higher on the scale, and so experiencing these types of things more often during a day is then correlated to less burnout and more happiness. And
right. And so, more frequently. So many times a day, every day, occasionally, and never. The higher the score tends to be linked to good outcomes generally.
So what Lynn's telling me is that people who take this scale and mark that they have the experiences in these 16 questions more frequently, more times during a day, they can relate to this as something that they feel regularly as a part of their life, these people are also the ones who seem to be able to do very difficult, complicated jobs and not burn out. These are the ones who seem to be happier. These are the people who seem to be filled with something else in their lives that drives them. And the other fascinating thing about Lynn's scale is she's not just measuring Americans.
Tens of thousands of people have taken the test all over the world. It's been translated into over 30 languages.
Wow.
And it's available free for nonprofit use as long as people register with me, which is a good thing for a scale. A lot of times people charge for scales, so it means it's kind of available to a lot of different kinds of people.
But what is it that this scale is measuring? What do these people have? What are these people experiencing that's different?
What does it measure? Okay, so what does it measure?
Yeah.
Okay, so the kinds of things are, the description is ordinary experiences of relationship with the transcendent or more than in life or divine. So people think of that in different ways.
Right.
And the kinds of things are things like awe, sense of gratitude, sense of being guided by the divine in daily activities or asking for help from a higher power, loving others with the kind of other-centered love, acceptance of others in a fundamental way, feeling a kind of a divine love from others or from a divine source, transcendent joy when together with others or sometimes when alone, kind of that lift you out of the sort of worries of the day. Religious and spiritual strength and comfort, and inner peace and harmony.
Wow.
So those are that's what we tried to wrap up in the items to get a nice broad spectrum. So not everybody's going to respond to all of these, but there's going to be a clump that people are going to respond to, and you get this average score, and so the average score kind of balances out between people.
So how do you design questions that get at things that seem so intangible?
Okay, well that's a really good thing. And then why did I get them? Why did I put numbers on them? And why do you do them psychometrically? And I think that is so I've been kind of passionate about measurement all my life. I've been sort of did this Oxford book on measuring stress. How do you measure whether somebody's stressed or not? That's not an easy thing.
Right,
you think one person and another, they differ. And you think when you ask yourself a question, you ask the question, how are you, to somebody, they usually say fine. And that doesn't really give you a very good answer. Or you ask somebody, are you nice? And almost everybody says they're nice. You're not going to say, no, I'm not nice at all. So you can see how if you answered questions like that, you're going to be skewed to one direction. You're not going to get the kinds of answers you want. So designing questions that work for a lot of different kinds of people and get at these very amorphous things. It was not so easy to do that, and it was important to develop it so that it would be dependable. So that when you asked the question and you got an answer, you felt like you were actually knowing about the things. And so I started with a kind of a theoretical framework that drew on a lot of religious traditions, and then it drew on psychosocial stuff, stuff about how people operate in terms of their emotions and feelings and things like that. So I used that and how we develop self-report measures. And then I came up with some preliminary questions, and then I tested them for understandability. And this was one of the most fun things to do because I got to interview hundreds of people in the U.S. and different socioeconomic status, inner city folks, people who were deeply religious. And then I was involved in a World Health Organization project, so I got to interview people from many different kinds of religions, which was so enriching for me. It was one of the most enriching experiences of my life, I think. And then I got to see, do these questions work for you? When I would ask people, well, when I ask you this question, what kind of experiences does it pull up for you? Which gave me an idea of whether the question was working. And then I also asked, is it understandable? Can you understand the question? And partly how they answered it helped to. So I wanted simple questions. And, you can imagine if you were trying to describe the nature of awe, you could get into paragraph upon paragraph, especially, as an academic, and then, you don't really get at it for ordinary people, and I wanted this to be a scale that worked for all kinds of people. So, and then I came up with 16 questions because I didn't want it to be too long.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, as I said earlier, I wanted a scope of
Right.
things. And then with the numbers, I also can test psychometrics for the scale. I can see if all the scores lean toward one end or lean toward the other. If you ask the questions again and again, do you get the same answer? In some ways, you want to have something getting the same answer. On the other hand, one of the nice things about this scale is that it can change over time. So they talk about basically state and trait, and traits are supposed to be solid over time. You know, maybe one's an introvert or an extrovert, and that may be something that kind of stays consistent over time. But the DSES has some consistency, but it also can change as people grow or change in various ways in life. And it's often now used as a before and after measure in certain studies to see interpersonal change, which I think is one of the most useful ways to use the scale, comparing the numbers with yourself rather than comparing you with somebody else. Although these big general numbers allow us to make some conclusions about it, which is helpful.
Right. So one of the things that Lynn says is very important when individuals sit down to take her scale, and that's different about her scale as opposed to a lot of large measuring tools, is that there are two introductory statements at the top of this sheet of paper. And, you're looking down at a bunch of questions with a scale of 1 to 6, and then you've got these two statements up at the top.
First of all, it says to people, whatever score you get is fine. It has everything's fine. There's no wrong answers. Whatever your experience is just fine. And then it has a second thing that says, a number of items use the word God. If this word is not a comfortable one for you, please substitute another word that calls to mind the divine or holy for you. So it was a challenge in this scale. I wanted it to apply to religious people, but also to people who were not particularly religious. So I have a bunch of items that don't have God in them. But for the religious people, instead of putting in another word that they might not be comfortable with, they get to put in the word.
And Lynn has had the chance to personally work on many of the translations of her scale. And so each time it's used in a different context, this introductory statement changes slightly.
The Mandarin introduction, reads, let's see here. The term God appears in many of the statements below. If you have a religion, this term refers to the divine power in your belief. If you do not have a religion, the term God would refer to the higher power, the regulator, the truth of nature of the universe.
Wow.
So I work with people in these 30 translations. One of the things I have really enjoyed has been working with people on the translation. So you try to get something that really works for the culture. And these different introductions help to kind of flesh it out a little bit. It's okay just saying substitute something that indicates the divine or holy for you. That's enough. But sometimes it helps to flesh it out by giving some options. So the Portuguese options they give, for example, higher power, ultimate reality, goddess, Lord, supreme consciousness, Tao, holy other, or great spirit. So for a lot of people, God works. And when I did the interviews, even for atheists, if they have that capacity to substitute, it still they seem to be able to answer that they have these experiences. Sometimes it's helpful to have suggestions for people of what to substitute.
So they found ways of addressing this idea of God or the divine or the universe or some greater power in a way that appears to be actually quite widely applicable. I had a curiosity around the first introductory part of the scale. So the other part of the introduction is that there is no right or wrong score.
Right.
And it's your score is your score, and it doesn't. And so I'm curious also because you were saying earlier that having these experiences more frequently is also, it's correlated to all these other good things in life. And so is that something that you ever talk about with people or that others who have used the scale in ways that it's been administered? Particularly, I'm curious, I guess, in these before and after tests, if people are scoring higher after, is that then a conversation ever with these people that says, here are these correlations?
Yes.
Or is it always left as your score is your own thing?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work that's been done with the scale has been in research, and so they don't even talk to the people. I mean, research, the people are irrelevant to them, and so they then look at the correlations. And for example, it's just been used recently in basically it's a treatment facility and an adoption agency for abused and neglected children, and it was used. It's been used as a before and after. For staff, actually, in that, to see, how they are doing, in a variety of ways. And they do activities with the staff that they are hoping will make the scores go up. Okay, so in a way, from the organization's point of view, they get to see, this has had some effect on this nice thing that then affects that has less burnout. Okay, and so scores on the daily spiritual experience scale predict less burnout. They predict, better relationships with others. Typically, I mean, this is of course normal curve. So I think they are able to give that kind of feedback to the employees from that point of view. If you do something and then you see your own score going up, and these things are generally related to good things, it's usually a positive aspect of your life. And seeing them go up, you think about what's going on in your life. Sometimes it can go down. It can just reflect that you've been just not attending to certain things in your life. And I think that's one of the things that the scale measures is what do we pay attention to? You hear a lot about mindfulness, and mindfulness is a good thing, and mindfulness is typically linked with good things in life. I think the scale is a kind of a different kind of mindfulness in that you are drawing attention to particular things. So I feel thankful for my blessings many times a day, occasionally, never, almost never. Very often our days just zoom past us and we don't pay attention to what's good. And we've kind of gone through the day and we're just wiped out in the evening, and then we're wondering what hit us. If one is paying it, then when you look back, have I been thankful for my blessings over the last week or two? How often? It kind of draws if your attention has been drawn to those things, you're more likely to then score higher on the scale.
Right.
Okay, or I feel deep inner peace would be another. Somehow we have to be paying attention to these feelings and this connection to the transcendent to experience it. I feel spiritually touched by the beauty of creation is one. We can walk through a beautiful place and be thinking about our laundry, and we just miss it, or one of them is I feel God's love, or I feel divine love for me directly, or I feel divine love for me through others. So in a way you're drawing attention to these things. And that's one of the things that people can reflect on themselves that is helpful. And seeing how the score might change over time is what I am doing in my life, nurturing this aspect of myself that can also help me from getting burnt out, help my relationships with others. That would be, an example in this thing of that.
So in that sense, then, it's possible that also just the experience of taking the scale itself can have this effect of awakening more consciousness about, if I'm looking at it and I'm saying, I'm grateful for my blessings, and I'm thinking, wow, I don't really ever think about my blessings.
Exactly,
What are my blessings?
Yeah.
And then possibly, so that, having that experience just in and of itself could awaken in me more of a consciousness of, gee, I don't think about those things that often, and maybe then the next week I do start thinking about it, or maybe I don't. But that it sounds like that experience of having these questions laid out can in and of itself start awakening a difference that could even show. So I guess what I'm suggesting is it possible to take the scale and then a week later take it again and have your scores go up just from the point that you've started thinking about?
That is a really good point. That is a really good point, because as a researcher, you almost don't want that to be happening because, you don't want the questions to affect the people, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, one of the reasons recently I wrote a book for the general public, this Spiritual Connection in Daily Life. And one of the reasons I did is that I think exactly what you're saying, that by answering the questions, we just in and of themselves, trying to reflect on them, I feel guided by the divine in the midst of daily activities. I feel selfless caring for others is one of the items. By drawing our attention to that, when we think back, did I ever feel selfless caring for others over the last week and a half, and when does that happen, and what does it feel like for me? By answering that, especially qualitatively, when you try to, let's say, write down what it feels like for you. When you answer the question, you can skim past it a little more quickly, but I really think you're correct that in answering the questions, we probably will increase our scores naturally.
So there's something about this scale that seems, at least the way that Lynn is phrasing it, that maybe we should all just be taking this all the time and thinking about these things. And she's got a fairly extensive list of things that high scores on this daily spiritual experience scale seem to be predictive of.
What it predicts, I'm trying to kind of remember what it predicts. Okay, recovery from drug and alcohol abuse it's very predictive. It predicts less suicides, predicts less burnout, and it's been used in teachers and nurses and hospice carers. Better staff retention, better relationships, longer marriages. It's kind of nice.
And this is among both religious and secular individuals?
Yeah, so it's usually done in a group, and in fact, there was a study in the Basque country that showed the atheists actually scored higher on the scale than the people who called themselves religious, maybe because of the particular spiritual history there or whatever. So it's not necessarily, there's been studies about religion and health and religion and outcomes, and I think this has appealed to people because it has questions like, I'm spiritually touched by the beauty of creation. You don't really have to have a particular religious orientation, and even the ones that have a God in them, if you use the substitution of the divine language, you're thinking about a kind of a more than in your life. I feel strength and comfort from my religion or spirituality. One of them is I feel strength from my religion or spirituality. I feel comfort. Those kinds of feelings, if people use the spirituality word, it touches a lot of people. And so I think that's why it predicts. And in fact, a lot of people who have drug and alcohol abuse problems are estranged from their religious approach. And so I think that's one of the reasons it works well in that population, maybe compared to some other things that would just measure religious outcomes, And I think this scale, one of the reasons I designed it, I think it addresses the depth of religion for religious people, not maybe beliefs, but, sort of how it operates in their life, as well as being able to work for people who are not religious. And that's one of my hopes in terms of conflict resolution, that it might be helpful, to bridge those groups. Other things it has predicted is greater happiness. I have to look at notes for these. I can't even. Better health behaviors, adherence to treatment. So people tend to stick, they've done it with adolescents. They tend to stick with their cancer meds and stick with their diet more if they're higher on the DSES.
Interesting.
But not necessarily if they're more religious.
So there's something going on with the daily spiritual experience scale that's not just about religious experience. There's something going on here that seems to be beyond religion, and maybe not really about religion at all. There's something going on that may be, in a way that Lynn puts it, just about daily life.
So there's something about this that has to do with daily life, I think, and maybe a more kind of maybe embodied approach that might be helpful. Less depression, less loneliness, less anxiety, more pro-social attitudes, and more helping behaviors, which is kind of nice.
It's great.
You know. So those are some of the ideas, some of the things that it's been linked to in studies.
So there's an enormous amount of data and research that's come out of the use of this scale, and Lynn has quite a bit of this. She's shared just really kind of the tip of the iceberg in this interview here. But we're still talking about a scale, a research tool for data collection. But it seems to be linked to so much of these sort of larger life questions types of things. And so what Lynn is exploring right now, and part of what's interesting to us here in the peacemaking and conflict resolution world, is can this be used beyond a research tool? Can some of what she's getting at here and some of these discoveries, can this be used in communication? Can this be used as a way of building bridges between individuals?
That's a particularly interesting use for this. We're at the beginning of exploring that in some ways. I did the book in a way to have a method for people to be able to use these questions to communicate. But the potential, I think, is there because you're really sharing about particularities rather than generalities. And we can get estranged from one another on generalities, but often the particularities can draw us together. And one of the examples that I used when we were talking last was the Lady Gaga video.
Right.
And there was a kind of a takeoff done by this lab in China called Stuck in a Bad Project. And it was laboratory workers in lab coats in China dancing to the Lady Gaga song with their words about it being stuck in a bad graduate school project, in China, in biochemistry, basically. And it went viral. And I think one of the reasons is everybody's been stuck in a bad project. They have the feelings, and these people had the bad supervisor. They were trying to complete their project. They weren't getting it through to the end. They wondered if they would ever get a job. These sorts of feelings that people had were very specific on the one hand, but we all could relate to them.
Yeah.
And I think that, or many of us could anyway. And I think that's one of the things that the DSES has, those kinds of things. So when I could talk about some of the specifics in a minute or two on some of the items. But that, I think, helps it to work as a tool of communication. So you're not sort of having a conversation with someone, I believe in the afterlife and hell.
Right.
And the person says, well, where does that put me? And then there you are at odds.
Right.
Or,
Right.
A very technological language about their own religious belief system. The other person can't tune into that at all. And then there isn't common ground. Whereas if you're talking about, I feel strength from my religion or spirituality, and someone talks about how that operates in their life, a woman in the inner city going home at the end of a day and just feeling totally wiped, and at the bus stop having to go home to her kids. And her religion, spirituality, give her strength to go through that. Somehow, even if we haven't been in that situation, it can make us think, oh, well, maybe there's something like that in my life too.
Yeah.
And sharing about that at that sort of deep level of spirituality, of these kinds of transcendent, more than things in life, can help us to bond. And then you're seeing someone who has a very different belief system than you do. So you see, somebody who maybe is an agnostic or an atheist, and you maybe have a religious belief system, and yet you're seeing, there's commonalities here. And I think that could be helpful. It hasn't been used in kind of very often anyway, in kind of like even marriage counseling, but I know that I have worked with some couples who have religious differences, and just using the draft of the book, they've kind of worked through the items with each other, and then we're able to have conversations that helped them to understand one another a little bit better. So I think that, even in interpersonally, generational family things, but then moving into something like conflict resolution, you have people who are with very different belief systems, and some people who think a religion is silly, and you've got this around the table, and these, you're still going to have a few people that don't relate to any of the questions, But it seems to be reasonably rare that someone completely answers no to all of them. But even if they do, you can't really say that the other person's experience isn't valid.
Right.
You can say what you believe, I don't believe. But when you think about someone's experience is their experience, and you can't really deny that. So it kind of creates a kind of an openness.
So there's something in the commonalities that is pushing a particular button for Lynn that seems to be really the key that this scale is getting at, is allowing individuals to find commonalities on a level where it's not actually that common. Talking about religious differences, particularly in today's world, we don't often find a lot of commonalities. And so finding a scale that's been used so broadly and that does allow people to say, yes, I've had that experience. Yes, I somehow relate to that. Regardless of how we relate to it in our own lives, that there's some commonness there. There's something that someone else has had a similar experience. But we're still talking about a scale. We're still talking about numbers on paper. And so Lynn is really at a point now of trying to move beyond that. And one of the things that she mentioned to me is taking the scale away. What happens if you use these as open-ended questions? What happens if you use these as prompts to start a discussion?
That's where my inside of my head is going on the questions. You have all this data and all these studies, and you know it has correlations and everything, but it's using them in an open-ended way that I find the most excitement right now. And one of the ways that you, of course, in conflict resolution have probably kind of rules and sort of things that you put out there on the table when you try to do a discussion, and those kinds of things. And those will be kind of given, and you would want to do those. But when you're especially talking about this topic, I came out with a set of 5 things, I think it's about 6 things, that I thought were really important if you're going to have this kind of conversation about this topic. And I think it would help when we frame this up to use those. And then kind of ground rules, for using the daily spiritual experience questions in this kind of dialogic way. And the first is to kind of respect others and expect respect in return. So kind of returning to that in the discussion, whoever's facilitating. And be specific and concrete. It's easy for us, in a way, it's talking about personal things, so it's easier to talk about generalities. But I think these specifics are where people really bond with each other. Hold things loosely. It's easy to tighten up around beliefs, be they religious or scientific or whatever beliefs they are. It's just easy to seize up, and to hold things loosely and to kind of return to that really helps. And not to give unsolicited advice. It's so easy, somebody says, okay, well, this is a hard time, and this is how religion and spirituality help me, and it's so easy to want to dive in there, so that's the other thing. And then not proselytize. I think it's very important to have a non-proselytizing kind of rule in these discussions, because a lot of people feel strongly about their faith, or lack of faith, or belief in whatever they believe in, and they want to convince other people. And on the one hand, you want to enable people's passion to be there, but not push their passions on others. And then the final one is, I originally was going to call this kind of like ordinary spiritual experiences. It's not about seeing visions, hearing voices, and it's so easy to give high ground to those more dramatic things. And this is about ordinary things that can be sustaining for people. So I think those rules are important when we do things like this.
So Lynn has these conversations and uses these open-ended questions around kind of the central themes that she actually pulls out of them. So you may have a group of individuals who has taken the scale and who has these things kind of mulling around in their mind, and Lynn will center a conversation on some of the themes that were going on when she was designing the questions.
One of the themes is compassionate love, which I've done a lot of research on over the years and written a Science of Compassionate Love book, so I'm kind of into compassionate love. But it has 2 items, which are about giving other-centered love. It's I feel a selfless caring for others many times a day, never. And I accept others even when they do things I think are wrong, which is a very important question. So it's kind of valuing the other fundamentally.
Yeah.
It's getting at that. So those two are the kind of love flowing out of us. And then there are two items that really address love flowing into us. I feel divine love for me directly, and I feel divine love for me through others. And those four love questions are really worth exploring in an open-ended way. And they could, I think, those would be just 4 of the 16, but you can imagine how that would work in a dialogic conversation in an open-ended way. So to give some examples of the kinds of answers people give to an open-ended, if we start with, I feel divine love through others. These are some of the examples from interviews on this. A kind smile from a stranger in a public place. So we don't have to be kind of just like unconditionally loved all the time by somebody, so feeling divine love directly through others can happen in the simple aspects of daily life. And if you're really in rough times, something like that can really make a difference. The touch of a hand and eye contact during the sign of peace at church was something somebody said. Cooked dinner with a warm smile from my spouse was something somebody said. Encouraging words in the workplace. So somehow this other-centered love, we're talking about kind of how do we experience this kind of care that somebody gives that doesn't expect something in return, is something that's focused on my good rather than their good. Maybe not totally, but a good bit of it, My mother's love for me was another answer. When imaginatively remembering a time when I was really loved by someone in a solid way without expectations was an answer. So how people experience that, and I can imagine in a discussion group, and when I've done it in small groups, this opens up the kind of conversation it opens up with people about what does it feel like to experience this divine love, And then there's the other question with divine love directly. And some people find it a lot easier to feel divine love directly, and some from others. I mean, one of the groups that I interviewed that was a very unusual group was this group of Trappist monks.
Wow.
So they were, sort of Cistercian, they're in kind of enclosed monks. And about half of them thought it was easier to experience God's love directly, or divine love directly, but half of them thought it was much easier to experience God's love and more frequently through other people. So, and they were able to use the God word in that context, but I think that's the case in a lot of people in the world too. This divine love is important for us, and how do people experience it? And some people, their religion is very important to them, but some people, it can flow in daily life in this kind of way. Another example of the open-ended ones, we think about love flowing out then, I feel like selfless caring for others, which, it took a long time to get the words, and it's not really this. I asked a lot of questions to find out if this was, I don't want people to be kind of destroying themselves to love others. It should be a balanced caring for others, but not one that's centered on me, but centered on them. And this wording seems to get at it. It's one of the challenging ones to translate, as you can imagine, to get that in different languages is very challenging. And I don't know whether I mentioned the kinds of languages it's been translated into are things like Hindi, Mandarin, Arabic, Persian, kind of like Serbian. So when we work on the translations, Romanian, Spanish, French, German, I mean, it's translated in a lot of languages, Korean, Indonesian. So it's like a lot of languages. And I work on the translations with people. And what is really the other thing that made me understand more about the open-ended and enjoy it more, the value of the open-ended questions, was in working through with people from another culture. How do you get this question to really get at what we wanted to get at in the question? And I'm coming from one sort of culture belief set. They're coming from a very different culture belief set, and we're coming up with something that obviously gets at their culture and gets at the culture that I'm from, and developed this, originally started in developing the scale. And it's just delightful. And then sometimes we involve other people. For example, there was a project in Romania where northern Romania has Hungarians and Hungarian-speaking people and Romanian-speaking people. And I was visiting Romania, and we were working on the Romanian translation. And the Romanian-speaking people tend to be Orthodox, and the Hungarian-speaking people tend to be Roman Catholic. And there's been fighting over the years extensively in northern Romania between those two groups. We ended up, when we were doing the translation, the woman who was doing the Romanian translation, the psychiatrist there, was Hungarian, and so we had to involve a Romanian to help to get it to be a really good translation. We ended up talking among the three of us about the wording, and even in that, it had a bridging effect.
Absolutely.
These would have been people who are basically distrustful of each other. And I've had another experience. I lived in Northern Ireland for about 10 years. And I haven't been able to test this in Northern Ireland, which I'd love to sit down in a group discussion. You know, I'd love, people like yourself to, be engaged in that kind of thing. But I know that it's been used effectively in Northern Ireland, and just my experience of the distrust between the two religious groups there, and to know that they have these common experiences, and they're related to, as you were saying earlier, something that's fundamentally important to people. So, I'm going to give a few more examples of an open-ended, I feel a selfless caring for others when working in a soup kitchen for homeless people. So people have to remember moments to answer. One of the reasons it has a number scale is you don't want to say, I'm really nice, or I'm really caring, but instead they're just trying to think, well, how often did I feel a selfless caring for others, So I'm a nurse, and when I care for patients, I often give more of myself than is required, was an example for the nurse. Allowing someone who looks harassed to step in front of me in line was what somebody said, When I help someone out that I don't like was one of them. One of them was given to charity online. So it can be a real wide spectrum of things. And I think that the discussion of this in a group where you're sharing about how you feel, how you feel strength from your religion or spirituality, or when you feel these accepting others, even when they do things you think are wrong. What does that feel like for you? Not whether you think it's right or not right, but do you ever do it? And if you do it, what does it feel like? The open-ended nature of the questions, I think, draw out of people these kinds of experiences.
Yeah, I think one of the things that stands out to me so strongly hearing these is that none of these sound particularly religious to me, which is fascinating in the way that I think that there's a tendency, and I, to speak for myself personally, as more of a secular individual, hearing these things and hearing these types of responses, then I think it brings it down to more of an approachable level where I can say, oh yeah, I've experienced that, or I've had a similar experience, or I resonate with that. Whereas having just I think religion is, it can get to this point of feeling unattainable and feeling like, this person has this thing that I don't understand, that I'm not a part of, that I can't access. And so we're innately at odds because of that. Whereas, talking about, these are the times in which I feel divine love. Great, I feel that.
Exactly.
I've had that experience. And so I think there's a thing there that totally fascinates me in terms of really making these types of things accessible, particularly today where religion is becoming such a crucial thing and so conflictual in a lot of ways that bring it down to a level where people can say, these are moment to moment experiences of my life that I tie to religion, and that someone else may say I tie that to something spiritual, or I tie that to just stepping back and letting the universe take care of me.
Yeah, right.
Whatever
exactly.
it is, however you describe it. But if everyone, hearing something concrete like letting someone get in front of you in line.
Right.
And you go, oh yeah, I know that experience.
Yeah.
I know the time when I've done it, or I know a time when someone else has done that for me.
Yeah.
And that's felt great. And so I think that that community and that ability to create community across what feels like a divide,
right, with
accessible moments of things that we can actually relate to.
Right. Well, that's good to hear.
That's where I see a lot of power in this.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Yeah, and the fact that it has worked psychometrically,
right.
Even though I'm not attached to the numbers, it helps. That's helped to make me feel that these questions were worth pursuing further, and in this kind of way.
Yeah.
And I think too, although it works. They wanted. Originally, people were trying to get me to exclude any kind of religious language from this thing. Mm-hmm. But in a way, this allows the people who are religious, which there are a lot of people who get their strength and they're sustained by these things, to have a conversation with people who are of a very different faith or are not religious about particularities, and they maybe are more likely to feel comfortable sharing about how this works for them,
right.
In a religious context, and it doesn't necessarily separate people. Mm-hmm. They're able to say, sort of one of them is, I feel guided by the divine in the midst of daily activities. Mm-hmm. And the way people think of that, as you say, some people it's more of a sense of, the universe moving me, or somehow the way things are unfolding in a providential way, or but some people feel it in a very particular religious way.
Yeah.
But somehow when they answer the questions, it doesn't polarize. Mm-hmm. It helps people to see where there is something common, and the love items in particular, are good. But I feel deep inner peace.
Yeah.
For example, is one of the questions. Some people feel deep inner peace when they're praying. Some people feel deep inner peace when they're in nature. Yeah. Some people feel deep inner peace somehow in the middle of a very trying situation, when they just are able to disconnect from it a little bit. Mm-hmm. It's very different how it is, and when people can share about that, going back to what you said at the very beginning, this is an important aspect of a lot of people's lives. Yeah. And if it gets set off the table always, we might be missing out on something that has a capacity to bridge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's crucial. So to completely switch gears just for 1 minute, I'm curious through this whole conversation, what made you come up with this idea? Why a daily spiritual experience scale?
Oh, yeah. Well, I said I was doing measurement, right? Well, I was working at a foundation, and we were doing a collaborative project with the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. Mm-hmm. And the foundation I was working with wanted to address the whole person. Okay, so it was very interested in addressing the whole person. And to do that, so that's how I got into measuring stress and measuring social support. How do you measure these things? And at the NIH in medical studies and social science studies, you have to have a number on things. Mm-hmm. So the question was, does people's religiousness, spirituality influence their health at all? And that was the question. And the National Institute on Aging I did a collaborative project with them, and it was kind of looking at methodological issues. How do you study something so messy as religiousness, spirituality? Because if you can't study it well, you can't put it in a study that has an outcome that shows that, correlations and, all that kind of thing. So in the context of that, I pulled together a working group of people who really had measured different things, around spirituality, religiousness, things like church attendance, synagogue attendance, daily, how many times do you pray a day? There were those kinds of measures out there. What was your religious history? How do you use religion to cope? Those were some of the scales that were out there. And I was chairing the group and co-chairing it actually with somebody from University of Michigan. And I said, something's missing here. We've got these scales, we're going to come up with these, we're going to set them out so that people have them to choose from to see which ones they want to look at in this context. I said, just the nitty-gritty of how people draw on spirituality in a daily way and, the sort of ordinary things of life. And that are that would be classified as spiritual. Yeah. And they said, okay, that's fine. You do a spirituality measure, they said. And I said, well, I don't really think it's just spiritual. I think I want something that hits this for people who are religious as well as people who are not. And they said, well, if you want to, you'd have to develop it. There's nothing like that out there. So I took my spare time and vacations and weekends and went and started to do interviews. And then whenever I was at a project or something, I would sit down with people at dinners and evenings, and then I started doing more and more interviews to refine the scale. And then it ended up, the 16 items were refined and put on the General Social Survey, which is a random sample. And but that's how I started it. And it just kind of, I did an initial paper on it with a statistician, and that gave the psychometrics. And then I just forgot about it, really, for a while. And it started being used more by other people. And then eventually I did a qualitative paper that kind of talked about how I developed it, exactly. How did I develop it? Which I think a lot of people have found quite useful, because a lot of times in the social sciences, people just think, oh, that's a good question, let's ask that. Right. And in fact, recently somebody came to me and said, we've been trying to come up with something that didn't use the word God, and because we think it's going to be polarizing. But we now look at your introduction and we think, this is a very, when we talk about Occam's razor, it's a good, simple solution here, and it worked. So it just has kind of had its own life. And I get people, because I asked for registration, people email me and register, and then I have a kind of website that people can go to for whatever I can keep up in my spare time on the scale. And then working on translations. People they say, we want to use it in Pakistan. Is there an Urdu translation? And I say, no, but we need to develop it. So then we develop it.
Wow.
So that's how this scale has unfolded.
Great. Well, thank you. So then if others are interested in looking at the scale or using it in any way, they can get it on your website?
They get the Daily Spiritual Experience Scale is a website. www.dseScale.org is that website. And then the book, The Spiritual Connection in Daily Life, which is just out this month.
Wonderful, congratulations.
It has a site too, and the book is more taking it in the direction that we have been talking about. The Daily Spiritual Experience Scale website, if you want to register and you want to see the scientific studies, and that's good for that. If you want to start to explore how to use the scale in an open-ended way and in communication, the book's a good start for that. And the website has, hopefully I'm going to be putting more stuff on that website to enable that to happen. But people can also just take it themselves and run with it.
Great.
So
wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and talking to me. It's been really, really exciting.
Nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you to Lynn Underwood for her work, her research, and for allowing us to share it. If you'd like to learn more about Lynn's work, access any of the links to the websites that she mentioned, or to hear any of our other podcasts in this series, please visit our website at scar.gmu.edu/CPP and click on the podcast link on the right-hand side. Thank you for listening.